Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald, also on the podcast, Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister, Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for being here. Hello. If this is your first time with us, please subscribe to the podcast so our episodes keep dropping into your feed every single week. We're very glad to have you there. Welcome. On the podcast today, then, we're considering the Supreme Court ruling, which unanimously ruled that a woman is defined by biological sex under equalities law. Susan Smith from For Women Scotland will join us in the next couple of minutes for a conversation 1 week on about what's changed and perhaps what hasn't. I think crucially as well, Holyrood is back after Easter recess, Westminster is back after Easter recess, and so the politicians have been responding. We'll discuss all of that. You can watch us on YouTube as well. Just search for Holyrood Sources, where we upload clips and full episodes for you to enjoy. Head to YouTube, subscribe to our channel there for all the videos and updates. You can follow us on X, watch our clips on TikTok, and join the mailing list for announcements and updates and all that sort of stuff at holyroodsources.com. As you're listening, you can WhatsApp us your thoughts as well. The number is 0333 404 6507. Let's get to it then. MSPs have returned from recess to contend, I think, with the implications of the Supreme Court's ruling last week that a woman is defined by biological sex under equalities law. Some of the responses in the last 24 hours, the First Minister, John Swinney, has accepted that trans women are not women in the eyes of the law, but has refused to apologise to feminist campaigners who have been vilified for defending biological sex. He's refused to state publicly that trans women are not women, but acknowledged that that is the conclusion of the court judgment last week. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer doesn't believe transgender women are women, according to his official spokesman. There's a whole range of other political responses that we'll get into over the course of this morning's episode as well. I think one thing that we should do, just to begin, is to listen to Dr. Michael Foran, who's a lecturer in public law at the University of Glasgow, who's been on this podcast before as well. He explained to Times Radio what the Supreme Court ruling actually means.
For our anti-discrimination law, any reference to sex or to woman or to man references biological categories, not self-identified categories or legal certificated categories. And that's going to have an impact on the operation of all of the anti-discrimination law that deals with things like single-sex spaces, toilets, changing rooms, prisons, sport, areas that are covered by our anti-discrimination law. It's now clear that when they reference sex, they reference biological sex.
That's Dr. Michael Foran. Some of Scotland's front pages today then. The Scotsman, SNP, told stop wasting time amid gender policy review. Minister can't give date for new guidance as Starmer U-turns. The Scottish Daily Mail says now say sorry to all women for trans chaos. SNP accept ruling from the UK's top court, but no apology. Daily Record says, let me go on, I'll edit that out. The Herald considers this as well. Ministers urged... I'm reading the wrong thing. That's the wrong thing from me. I will edit that out. That's my mistake. I apologise.
Lucky you're not live, Calum.
It's lucky I'm not live.
It's almost like you're a radio presenter.
Oh, my days.
We sounded so professional up until that point.
It was all going so well.
Right, hurry up,
will
Calum.
Absolutely change that. Let me just... That's the first time I've ever done that. Let me just change the intonation on that. And the Scottish Daily Mail says, now say sorry to all women for trans chaos. The SNP accept ruling from the UK's top court, but no apology forthcoming. Andy, just before we get to Susan, a thought from you. A week on from the Supreme Court ruling, politics is back. And, we will get into this over the course of the episode, but are politicians dealing with this well?
I think there are a number of politicians who I think feel that they have been empowered to say what they probably thought all along. I think that maybe raises some questions as to why they weren't saying it before, to be quite honest with you. But I do think that when you look at what some of them are saying, they clearly feel that there is the space to say what they think without being castigated for it. And I understand that because it was a difficult environment to speak up into in the past. So, I think you do see a series of them. But of course, that can be very easily painted as a U-turn as well. And you see with Starmer's comments over the last couple of days, I think that, he is now saying what he clearly thinks. He clearly was saying what he didn't actually think beforehand, but that doesn't necessarily reflect all that well on those politicians who are saying something a little different than they were before. And then, of course, you have the other side of the equation, and I suppose the decision that politicians who are on the other side of the coin are having to make is whether they double down on what they have always said, or whether they reflect and I suppose modify to a degree what they have said and how they have said it. And I think some of them are, and some of them are not.
Yeah, and Geoff, that's the thing. This has been such a potent political issue for so many years. And actually, the duration of this thing is almost, when you trace it all the way back to 2018, I think, when the first challenge was brought, the fact that this has dominated for so long, and politicians have wrestled with this for so long.
Yeah, absolutely, indeed. And look, I'm going to be very quick, because I'm much more interested in hearing from our guest today, actually, who's much more interesting than us. But I when we covered this issue some months ago, I said I couldn't for the life of me understand, when we think about this politically, when this topic got so charged, so toxic, so divisive in our parliament, we spent so much time in Holyrood discussing this, why our political leadership did not take the sting out of it and seek some sort of compromise and try and recognise that there was a hugely toxic issue that was starting to cut through into the wider public, and people were bemused, didn't understand it, and I think that was regrettable it wasn't happened. And therefore, I have to say that as an extension to that, I think it's regrettable that John Swinney, who is, the buck stops with him, he's the First Minister, has not taken the opportunity to apologise. His government has lost in the Supreme Court, and I think he should have apologised, and yes, most importantly to the women who have fought this case and won this case, but also actually to the trans community as well. I don't think this has benefited anyone, and the wider public who may not have been so engaged with this issue, because we've spent so much time, so much political capital has been expended, and I think it's only fair and proper that when a Scottish government loses in the court of law, that they recognise that. Yes, they recognise the decision, but also, and you can do it in a way that says, look, we could have done this better. We recognise. I think that kind of candour, that self-deprecation would be very well received by the wider public.
You mentioned the women who have fought this. They have been led by For Women Scotland, and among their leaders is Susan Smith, who joins us on the podcast. Susan, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
It's good to get some reflections from Andy and Geoff, who, of course, are on the pod every single week. I suppose your reflection a week on with what has changed and what has not changed in the last week. We focus on politicians and politics in this podcast, but perhaps you've broader reflections on how your last week has been since the ruling.
Well, in a way, it's sort of weird because everything's changed and nothing has changed, because we believe that was always the law. That was always what the letter of the law said. We've been vindicated. We've been proven right. But of course, what had been happening in the real world was that policies and guidance from government, it had just run so far ahead of the law, I think in anticipation of the law changing, or attempts to change the law, that now that's all going to have to be rolled back. And I think as well for us as an organisation, it's a massive vindication of everything we've done and said. So it's been really good to have that. It's interesting that some of the politicians, I think, are still not fully taking all this on board and what it means.
I think that's fascinating you say that, because even last week I spoke to a UK government minister on Times Radio and said, 24 hours on from the ruling, if a trans woman had used a woman's changing room yesterday, which changing room should they be using today? And they have since clarified this, but at that point, she couldn't answer that question. And I think it's that kind of hesitation and lack of clarity. And she said, oh, well, this is a new ruling. And I said, well, you're the government. We're looking for clarity. And I think that's been a point that I've been going over in the last week. You are the government. We've been looking for clarity. And it's taken, 7 years for clarity to come, Susan?
Yeah. There's been a lack of leadership, both in Westminster especially, because I think you're right. I don't think Keir Starmer bought into any of this, but he didn't dare say it. And now he's able to go out and say what he actually thinks. And, these are these are people at the top of our politics. They are paid a lot of money. They have a lot of power. We are just this little grassroots organisation. We don't get a salary. And we manage to stand up and say these things in the face of intimidation and threats. And I don't have very much respect for politicians who couldn't stand up when they had the capacity to do so. I have a lot of respect for politicians like Ash Reagan, Joanna Cherry, Joanne Lamont, and a lot of the Conservative women who did put themselves out there and did get the same kind of abuse that we did. And Rosie Duffield down south as well, obviously, who put up with so much. And I do think some of those women as well are owed apologies from their parties, less so the Conservatives, obviously, because they have been on side. But the women who stood up in the face of a lot of abuse internally, because they were right too. And I know the Liberal Democrats are probably not going to, because they're neither Liberal nor Democratic at the moment, and the Greens are just bonkers. But I hope that's all right if I say that.
You're allowed to say whatever you like on this podcast, Susan. That's what we're here for. It's conversation.
But I think you're right. I think they needed to be a compromise earlier. If they'd have come and spoken to us right at the beginning, it wouldn't have got this far. And in a way, although we always believed this was the law had been applied in a less than dogmatic fashion, that there had always been a little bit of blurry grey areas. And I think, in practice, that is likely to continue. I mean, I keep saying to people, nobody is going to walk into the toilets and set off an alert or have their DNA automatically scanned. But I think what we've gone back to is a situation where if a woman sees someone in a changing room that she is uncomfortable with, she knows she can go to the front desk of the gym and say, I think there's a man in there, and she won't risk being reported for a hate crime. And I know that sounds excessive, but that was actually the guidance that Glasgow Life were giving out about 5 years ago, that if somebody complained about a biological man who identified as a woman in their changing rooms, the staff should consider filing a hate crime report. So that was how extreme things had got. And that's the problem, that it had gone so far over that way that we had no choice but to pull it right back to the letter of the law.
I think when you say at the start as well of this that some things have changed and in some ways nothing has changed because of what you have believed all the way through this. I note that Scottish Government Minister Shirley-Ann Somerville said yesterday on the return of Parliament that she will work with the National Advisory Council for Women and Girls to advance women's rights. And I suppose, Susan, I mean, already I'm getting a sense of your reaction to that. But my question on that is whether you trust institutions to get it right.
The National Advisory Council was set up by Nicola Sturgeon, and they were largely her pals, and they told her what she wanted to hear, and then she went away and implemented it. It was this lovely little circle where everybody said what was current, and the women who sit on that National Advisory Council are all the women who betrayed us right at the start. So it's organisations like Engender, which went out of their way to tell women that we were bigots for having issues with this. Going right back to the beginning of all this in about 2017, Engender had promised a meeting to discuss gender recognition reform. And they were inundated by a lot of messages from women who were members saying, we're uncomfortable about this, we have issues about this, we need to have a conversation. And I think when they realised that most of the women they were in contact with were not on side, they cancelled that meeting, and then they put out an extremely patronising podcast with Becky Kaufman of Scottish Trans Alliance and Mridul Wadhwa, who famously headed up Edinburgh Rape Crisis, which was a bit of a pat on the head, silly women, why are you making such a fuss about all of this? So I have absolutely no confidence in that advisory council to lead in any way on this, because already some of those people, including Engender, have put out the most inane statements saying that this is taking feminism back years. I don't know how they're defining feminism, but obviously they're defining it in a way that isn't about women. So I think this is what I mean about governments not learning lessons, because what it looks like is they're just going to fall back on the same paid lobbyists who gave them the same duff advice 7 or 8 years ago.
Worth saying at this point that in anticipation that Engender might get mentioned on this episode, we were in touch with Engender via email about 24 hours ago now, inviting them to take part today. We've not heard back at this point, but that invitation does remain open. You mentioned Nicola Sturgeon there, Susan. We've not heard anything from the First Minister who introduced the Gender Recognition Reform Bill at Holyrood as of yet. How do you feel about that?
I think it's moral cowardice. And, this was somebody who put a target on the back of a lot of women, including women in her own party. She said our opinions weren't valid. She said that people were bigots, and what was it? It was something like that there was misogyny, transphobia, and possibly racism in a lot of the opposition to gender recognition reform. She never made any effort to speak to anybody and understand our concerns. She even within her own cabinet, my understanding is that she was dismissive of people who tried to talk to her about this. It was an arrogance, it was a failure of leadership, and it was intellectually very poor. So I think for her now to evade responsibility is the cherry on top of that, really, because if her opinion hasn't changed, if she thinks the Supreme Court got it wrong, fine, stand up and say that. But she's not even doing that. She's just in hiding.
I think it's been a fascinating exercise in politics, which we'll maybe talk about a bit later on as well. I just wanted to come back on one thing that Susan said about the sort of gym changing room example. Because I know that those who disagree with Susan will say, well, that never happens. That's never happened to anybody I know. This is such such an unlikely scenario. But I think it's important to understand, and I don't apologise for looking at this very much through the lens of, I've got 4 daughters and a wife, and I look at it through that lens, which I don't know, maybe some people think I should, maybe some people think I shouldn't, but anyway, I do. It's not just about the likelihood of that event happening. In other words, it's not just about being safe, it's also about feeling safe. Mm-hmm. It's about knowing that can't happen. And I do think that's an important distinction, because yes, that scenario would be extremely unusual, but it's about women and girls feeling safe as well as being safe, so that they know that when they go into that and when I as a father know that when my girls go into that sort of space, I have certainty that can't happen. I think that's a really important distinction, because other people will, people who disagree with Susan will say, well, this is a ridiculous example because it's not going to happen. But it's about knowing that it can't happen as well.
Yeah,
I think that's important.
People use that all the time. They say it's a tiny number. And we always say, well, how many is too many? And I don't think it is a tiny number, because, of course, one person, and knowing that there's one person going into that space, will have a knock-on effect on many, many women. And we keep hearing from especially ethnic and religious minority women who've said things like they can't go shopping anymore. They can't go to the gym anymore because of this possibility, because they are not allowed to be in that mixed space. There are women who obviously have suffered trauma who won't go in there. And then I think there are some people who deliberately set out to make an issue of that. And we saw that at the weekend. There were photos of groups of men basically barricading the women's toilets. And I think they felt they'd had permission to do that. They were very angry that they were now being told that this wasn't acceptable. But the fact that they're prepared to go and show themselves being threatening and intimidating in those spaces is just an illustration. I don't know why they thought that was a good illustration, because it's an illustration of what we've had to put up with.
I think this is an unfair question to potentially ask you, Susan. But I'm not much on social media these days, but I went on because of the significance of this judgment. And it has been febrile, utterly febrile. And I suppose I want to bring the conversation back to my comments earlier on. In my head, I can only see one way in which this is reconciled to any level, even if it's just an effort towards reconciliation. And that has to come from our political leadership, yes, in the Scottish Government, but in other political parties, because ultimately this was a public policy intervention to begin with. And therefore, it's up to the people that introduced that and discussed that to try and find some sort of equilibrium. How confident are you that that's going to take place? I mean, how do you view the next few weeks, months and years on this issue? Do you see any sense of compromise, equilibrium, reconciliation?
I hope so. I mean, we're not gonna go anywhere. I've been told that quite a few people in the Scottish Government thought that if they kept ignoring us, we'd go away, and we haven't, and we won't. And I am concerned, having listened to Shirley-Anne Somerville yesterday, that the government is still not stepping up and taking responsibility for this, that they are still kicking the can down the road. They're saying they need guidance from the EHRC. They really don't. They've got the law. They just need to get on with implementing what the judges ruled. And that's very clear. You know, people keep saying we need clarity. No, we've got clarity. We went to the court and we got clarity. I think there are going to be people who continue to fight back against it. And unfortunately, some of that resistance doesn't come from a place of reason at all. I think, you know, that's best exemplified by the sorts of comments we heard from Maggie Chapman. There's no rationale in there. It's just pure dogma and ideology. So that's one of the problems that we've got to deal with, that rather than people who are being intellectually curious and sensible about this.
And because I think, Calum, sorry, just to the point, I mean, I know you've made efforts to try and get some of the trans groups on, because I want to ask the same question. How do we get some sort of compromise in our public discourse on this issue? Is it possible? You know, I really want to see it from all sides here. And I know we've got a contribution, haven't we, from...
Yeah. So this is the thing. So we mentioned Engender, and we also got in touch with the campaign group Scottish Trans, which, according to their website, works to improve gender identity and gender reassignment equality, rights and inclusion in Scotland. Similarly to Engender, we've not heard back from them. But in their reaction to the Supreme Court ruling, they said, "We are really shocked by today's Supreme Court decision, which reverses 20 years of understanding of how the law recognises trans men and women with gender recognition certificates. We will continue working for a world in which trans people can get on with their lives with privacy, dignity and safety. That is something we all deserve." Now, given that these two campaign groups wouldn't or haven't got back to us yet, as I say, the invitation does remain open. I'm happy to hear back from them anytime. We actually got in touch with Ava, who's one of our listeners, who has messaged before and whose response we thought was pertinent to hear and to understand in light of the Supreme Court ruling. Now, it's a fairly long message. Ava wasn't able to record the voice message, but I've got the message to read out, so bear with me. Ava says, "As a young transsexual woman in Scotland, the Supreme Court ruling last week, although shocking, doesn't particularly come as a surprise, considering the judicial makeup of the court and the government's attitude towards trans rights. I came out as trans at the age of 12 to unsupportive parents, so tried to, in quote marks, live as a boy until the age of 16, where I started experiencing serious panic attacks and suicidal thoughts about my own body. Being trans isn't something that can be cured or prevented. It's a neurological condition that we are born with, nothing to do with upbringing or gender norms. As a Labour member since the age of 16, I've increasingly been questioning my viability within the party as the leadership continues to scaremonger against the trans community and use reform, with a capital R, reform-esque phrases such as organisational capture to describe trans-inclusive policies. Most trans people I know just want to have a normal private life and not have to constantly be fighting for our place in society. The politicisation of trans people and medical care has led some of my friends to even emigrate abroad due to the toxic and hateful attitudes towards us in recent years, as well as obscene private healthcare costs. Half of all trans women have experienced sexual assault or rape, and domestic abuse and trans femicide at the hands of violent men is also a growing concern in this country, so being barred from women's aid and refuge centres will only make the most vulnerable amongst us more at risk of harm. One of my trans female friends decided to use the men's toilets today, as apparently that's what this ruling wants us to do. She was immediately told she was in the wrong room by the cleaner and escorted out by the security guard. There is no point appeasing anti-trans viewpoints. Overall, I doubt this ruling will affect me directly. I'm not going to stop using the toilet, nor would I urge any of my friends to do so. As long as you pass, in quotation marks, you're not going to face any harassment, but it only opens the door to further delegitimization and stigmatization, and even more transvestigation. And I'll just add, for context, that that is a sort of conspiracy theory which takes hold about someone's sex based on photographs of them online and that sort of thing. Towards masculine and intersex women, says Ava, this is not a win for feminism. Just to end my message, if anyone's interested in donating, you can look up Edinburgh Trans Femicide Prevention on Instagram, which fundraises to help trans women fleeing intimate partner violence in Edinburgh. So that's a long message, but I thought it was important. Ava listens to this podcast, and I think it's important we represent Ava's take on all of this. It's notable, I suppose, Susan, this is not a win for feminism, is perhaps a line that's worth considering in that.
Well, what we always say is if you can't define women, you can't protect women, you can't campaign for women. I think there are a lot of people who seem to think feminism is about everybody in society. It's not. It's the only civil rights movement that is expected to look after people who are not in the same category. You do not get disability campaigns being told they have to campaign for people who are able-bodied. I mean, that's just it. So I think there is a protected characteristic in the law of gender reassignment, and it is absolutely right and proper that people within that category are able to get funds, services, spaces, facilities for themselves. That's what women had to do. But it's interesting because we've had all the people saying rights are not a pie and women letting people into their spaces. I think the phrase was, you don't lessen your own rights by improving those of other people. Well, now that's flipped, and these are women's rights, and suddenly rights are a pie, and suddenly everybody wants to have a share of our spaces. But they are there for a specific reason. They are there based on biological sex. And I think, there were a few points in Ava's statement that need to be considered. There is clearly a mental health aspect to this, and there are clearly people who will need a lot of support who are struggling with aspects to do with their own body and their own sex. And they do need that support, and that is possibly lacking. That is something they've got to look at. The organisations that have campaigned, Scottish Trans being one of them, have misled this group. They never had the right to identify as the opposite sex and take those services and space from women. They lied to them, so they need to be held accountable. And I think also they scaremongered. I mean, some of this, that there's never been a trans person killed in Scotland at all, ever, as far as we know. So they need to stop telling them they're at risk. I did an examination of some of the pieces of work that have been done by trans organisations to elevate this idea that they are an at-risk category, and they are some of the worst research. I don't even want to dignify them calling them research. They were self-selected surveys with very leading questions, and one of them lumped in late transitioning men whose wives were still using their original name. That they call that domestic violence. It was so, the parameters were so broad, but then this has all been taken back to Parliament, but also to the people who are vulnerable within that group. And they've been constantly told they're at risk of violence or they're at risk of suicide. And I'm not surprised young people believe that and start to think that we're all very evil for wanting them to do that. We don't want them to be hurt. That's the last thing we want. But we're not the ones who are encouraging this sort of histrionic fear. So I think those organisations need to have a look at how they've been behaving as well.
Susan, I know you have to go in just a few minutes. With just a couple more things, if that's okay. I think like 3 more minutes probably. Andy's going to come in at this point.
Yeah, look, I think rights are not absolute, and you can protect the rights of everybody, but you also sometimes have to prioritise rights. And when you're having a debate between the rights of half the population and the rights of a very, very tiny minority of the population, you do have to prioritise the rights of half the population. This is what this ruling did. It didn't diminish the rights of trans people. It clarified the rights of women and girls. I think that's an important point. Rights are not absolute, and sometimes they clash. I think that relates to Eva's message as well. I'd be interested to get Susan's perspective on this, because I think one thing that has been missing a little bit from some of the discussion since last week is actually what's happening in schools, and that does relate to what Eva said. Look, I would imagine that life for a trans person in school is extremely difficult. But there's another side to this equation as well, which is a very important side, which is the number of girls, and it is overwhelmingly girls, who are being socially transitioned in school.
Yeah.
Who are not trans, who think they're trans, but who are not, who may have mental health difficulties or may have a variety of other characteristics which they think are presenting as them being trans, and they are being socially transitioned, not malevolently, usually because head teachers don't know what to do and don't know what the rules are and are trying to do the right thing and end up accidentally not doing the right thing. And that's a relatively large group of people. Parents listening all around the country, they will know people in the schools that their children go to who this has happened to, who are girls, who are then boys for a while and then are not. Okay? Yeah. This is, I think, inevitably a significantly larger group than the group of people who are trans and can't transition. And I think we have to reflect the fact that this judgment doesn't actually necessarily impact that, but that schools and other bodies will need to reflect on that social transition aspect for young girls as well, because this is very dangerous for a lot of young girls.
Yeah, look, we need the school's guidance out, because that was unlawful even before this ruling, and we kept pointing it out to them. Girls, you're right, girls especially are at risk. We've heard from girls who say that being a butch lesbian places you at the bottom of the pile in schools, but you get a lot of social peer pressure, and you even get teachers, unfortunately, making comments about, what's your gender identity, and trans has been celebrated in schools. There have been organisations going into schools and really pushing this line. They say they're LGBT organisations, but they are not. They do not celebrate the L and the G. They celebrate the T. And I think for a lot of gender non-conforming children, and I have heard in recent days, it's the same for boys, although less so, but if you're a very feminine boy and you want to have long hair, you will get bullied. And I think this is the thing, that the bullying happens to these gender non-conforming children while they own their sex class. But the minute they start to say that they are the opposite sex, this pressure lessens. So there's no surprise that they are trying to do that. And I've seen the school's material. I've seen what organisations like TIE and LGBT Youth are saying. And that has to be rolled back. It cannot be allowed to continue, because we are seeing more and more young girls, especially, coming through that, having been on hormones, having sometimes had mastectomies, who are now regretting it. And that's awful, because these things are not reversible.
Susan, I have one last question for you. Just bearing in mind all that we've talked about and the podcast that we have here, I do wonder if you feel like there might be room for a political party in Scotland that focuses on women's rights in this country, and if that is the logical next place for your campaign to go.
We have been asked this a couple of times, and actually we were having a chat about it in Parliament last night, but it's a difficult one, because for us, the women that have been part of this movement have been from all parties, and they've been from all parts of the political spectrum in Scotland. For Women Scotland was started up by people who'd been on different sides of two referendums, or referenda, as I prefer to call them. And I think it was a really rewarding experience in that sense, because there were so many divisions that healed because of that, because we were all so united on this. And I'm not sure how you would have a political party that could be neutral on the constitution in Scotland, with things. And that is the only way I could see it working, that we were neutral on the constitution. So
yeah.
I don't know how that would work in contemporary Scotland.
Well, Susan, if I may be so bold, the journalist in me, all I'm hearing is Susan Smith doesn't rule it out. So, thank you so much for your time, Susan. It's been really great to speak to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks to Susan Smith for joining us on the pod this week. Right, should we start with the political party question that we finished with Susan there, and we'll get into some of the other stuff that we talked about as well. Andy, do you think there's space for a political party? As I say, I'm not just being funny, but legitimately, she hasn't ruled it out. It's not completely off the table.
Well, I certainly did think there was, over the last few months, I thought there was absolutely space for a political party focused on this issue of the rights of women and girls. I think whether or not there remains that space will depend largely on how the government and other political parties respond to what's happened. If everybody effectively moves on to the territory of saying, yes, we believe in single-sex spaces, and yes, we believe in what the Supreme Court said, etc., then you erode the opportunity for a party like that to do well. But if it looks like there's any kind of equivocation on this, and if it looks like the government in particular are not fully embracing what the Supreme Court decided, then yeah, I think there probably is. I mean, the way our system works, you're looking at right around the country. Let's say they stood one really credible, well-known candidate in every region around the country. They would need single-figure percentage of votes to return an MSP, and I could see that potentially working, but only if the issue remains heightened, and there is the potential for this verdict to actually de-escalate the issue, in which case I'm not sure the territory would be there.
Yeah. But I think your point on equivocation is probably the one that a lot of our conversation here is going to focus on, because we mentioned John Swinney, who it feels has been quite equivocal in the aftermath of this, sort of accepting the ruling, but not sort of going full-throated behind it. Also, Maggie...
Let's try and take the sting out of this. And I'm going to just repeat again, I do think it's incumbent on our political leadership, yes, the First Minister. It wasn't his... he wasn't in charge of the government when this legislation was initially brought, but he is in charge of the government now. And to just be able to say, look, guys, we could have done this better for the interests not just of women, but the trans community and wider public discourse. We could have got it better. Hands up, we will do better in the future. I actually think that'd be very well received. And we need that, I think. There's still such a gap in the market for that because of the things that you've just put to me, because that people are clearly very passionate, emotive, and are speaking, in my opinion, in this instance, totally out of turn. I just don't think that helps this debate at all.
And Andy, on the Greens, do we have to then question where they sit politically? So I suppose we often think of the Greens and the SNP being kind of aligned on the Constitution, and they've obviously worked in government before. There's a leadership process taking place within the Scottish Green Party right now. I just wonder if this is an issue that's going to be fundamental in that contest.
Well, I think that is a very interesting question. So if we look at the polls, obviously the SNP are doing well in the polls, but even a good poll has the SNP returning in the low 50s number of seats. So at the moment they're running a minority government with over 60 MSPs. In other words, they're only a few short of a majority to pass legislation and pass budgets and so on. They'll be much, much further away from a majority, most likely, after the next election. So they'll likely do well, it looks like, but they won't be anywhere near that sort of number. So they'll need help in the next parliament. a lot of help. And realistically, there's only two places to turn. There's the Lib Dems or there's the Greens. Now, this is where the Green leadership contest becomes really quite important, because I am certain that people in the government would like somebody like Ross Greer to be leader of the Greens. Ross Greer has been on this podcast before, as listeners will know. They would like somebody like Ross to be leader because he is seen as being more pragmatic, more reasonable, and easier to work with. However, if the comments by Maggie Chapman are reflective not just of her view, but of the views of the Green Party, and if many of the Green MSPs post-2026 agree with that sort of view, then I think that becomes a substantial problem for John Swinney and the Scottish Government to work with, because that sort of view on this sort of issue will eclipse everything else they're saying about other issues, and it will make it significantly harder for John Swinney and the SNP to make any kind of accommodation with that party. So they've got big decisions to make as a party in terms of how they respond to this issue, and the leadership candidates have got to think very carefully about how they respond to this issue too, because it's actually very pertinent, not just for now, but for the next several years.
A couple of other thoughts just by way of conclusion on this. So the Scottish Government, first of all, saying it has no plans to revive the gender reform bill. I do think on the issue of how politicians are responding, we should mention Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister. And by the way, just as a side note on this, that Gina Davidson from LBC's reporting on this has been relentlessly comprehensive. She's spoken to just about every MSP that she laid eyes on, I think, in the last 24 hours. Anyway, she credits her colleague Alan Czynski speaking to Deputy First Minister Kate Forbes on the Supreme Court ruling. She says the government welcomes the clarity of the ruling, but when asked about how she felt on hearing it, she says she was on holiday. And I'm just not sure that's particularly helpful, constructive, or moves the thing on in any way at all. Do either of you have a thought on that you would like to consider? I mean, why is the Scottish Government, why is the Deputy First Minister's response not slightly more conclusive than that?
Well, I was on holiday last week as well, in Tenerife. I had a bloody great time, by the way. I've still got a little bit, the remaining remnants of a tan. Look, you know...
I'm not sure anybody phoned you to ask for a comment on the Supreme Court ruling, though, when you were...
You would be surprised, Andy.
Ringing off
look, politicians represent the people.
Yeah.
And so, and the people elect the politicians. Where are the people at in large right now? Okay, I'm going to quote something from Alex Massey. I thought he had a wonderful column in Substack, and I really want to read this out to you because it really chimed with me, and it's where I think the vast majority of the population are. I quote, "And thirdly, I rather fancy is the much larger group of what might term normal voters who look at this and think, wait, was this ever in doubt? And if so, why? These are the people who wholly, sensibly believe trans men and trans women should be free to live as they please and without punishment or harassment for being who they feel they are, but also understand as a matter of first and core principle that no, you cannot actually change biological sex." And I genuinely think large swathes of the population are there. And so when we consider Kate Forbes' comments or anyone's comments from a political standpoint, they've got to remember that's probably where most of our electorate are feeling right now. And again, I am going to repeat myself for the fifth time. I think it would do the world of good for our discourse in this country, particularly around this issue, if there was just some sort of, do you know what, hands up guys, we could have handled this a hell of a lot better for the interests of all concerned. And that hasn't been forthcoming. And that would allow people like Kate Forbes to answer questions a lot more comprehensively than saying that she was on holiday.
This does become potentially becomes a problem for the government, I think, if it goes on too long. Look, we know what John Swinney thinks about this. We know what Kate Forbes thinks about this. The population needs to, I think, hear this in clearer terms. They need to understand what their government thinks. Now, we know why they're trying to be cute about it, because they have a massively split cabinet and a split group of MSPs who think a very wide variety of things about this issue, and they're trying to be careful and they're trying to keep the house together. And I completely understand all of that. But on an issue as big as this is a big issue, guys. This is the Scottish Government being beaten in the Supreme Court on a touchstone issue. And I think that at some point they are going to have to be very clear, using clear, understandable, unequivocal terminology so that people know where the Scottish Government as an entity sits on this issue.
Sorry, I mean, Andy, I agree with everything you've just said, but surely the ruling itself should act as a staging point to say, okay, right, that has now been clarified. And again, it's okay to say sorry. It's actually quite a good thing in society, in politics, to say we could have done better for all concerned. And I just don't see...
I think there's zero chance of that happening.
Well, so do I, which I just think is so unfortunate and regrettable.
I just think there is no... I cannot see a situation in which John Swinney will apologise. I don't think he's going to do that.
But you know... In fairness to Anna Sarwar,
yeah, okay. I was going to mention Anna Sarwar.
Go on. No, it's your fucking show. Carry on.
That's staying in.
Hell.
That's staying in.
A couple of nice clips on Times Radio, and then Billy McBoy.
That's all staying in. We haven't mentioned Anas Sarwar, I don't think, really by name at this point, who has faced criticism for how he's responded to all of this. Now, his U-turn happened on this podcast, you'll remember, a couple of months ago, when he and Jackie Baillie said they supported Sandy Peggy in her tribunal against NHS Fife, and they said, when questioned by Andy, that had they known then what they know now, they would not have backed the gender reform bill in the Scottish Parliament. Now, he came out and said that they've always backed, single-sex spaces for women, and he said that on X, and he got community noted pretty quickly and said, hang on a second, you voted for the gender recognition reform bill a few years ago. So, Geoff, on Anas Sarwar, is this further... What am I trying to ask? He's not going to be First Minister, is he? This is the bottom line.
Wait a minute.
This is the bottom line.
That's two different issues. No. Right, okay. So, what I give credit to Anna Sarwar is for trying to do a bit of what I'm saying, is trying to reconcile, recognise that, they kind of got it wrong. Perhaps the manner in which she's done it, I just think if you're going to do it, you do it full throat and say, hands up, completely, we got it wrong. Don't say, well, actually, I was in favour of this all along, and everyone's going, no, sure. And I get what he was trying to say, but sorry, I'm almost repeating myself consistently. This is why I think it's so important for our political leadership, not just in the Scottish Government, but across our political parties, to just, hey, for all concerned, trans community, women, everyone that's had to endure this debate, hands up. And if you do it in that way, I think most folk will criticise you, ridicule you, I'm sure, but ultimately they'll go, fair play.
Yeah, you move past it. Good. Right, thanks both for your thoughts on that. Just one question to finish the pod to each of you on John Swinney's summit, which is taking place today. We're recording before it takes place, but this is the First Minister who is bringing together political, faith and civic leaders to protect democracy. That's the plan here. About 50 organisations, political parties, charities, etc. are going to attend this forum today. All the Holyrood parties, except the Conservatives, are attending. He has not invited Reform UK to take part in the summit. That party, by the way, says it opposes far-right extremism, which has been mentioned by the First Minister as part of the motivation for this. He wants to unite parties to lock out the far-right from Scottish politics. Geoff, is this the way to do that?
Far right means the extreme right wing of a political party or group, belonging to or representing the views of the extreme right wing of a political party or group. Now, I may not agree with a lot of what reforms say, vast majority I'm sure, but I don't think they could be categorised from what I've seen as the far right. We've got to be careful how we throw this terminology around. I'm not saying that John Swinney's saying that Reform are far right, but he's also trying to be inclusive by being exclusive, and they've not been invited. Look, I think the politics of this are John's trying to create a wedge, and we know that Reform are taking votes from Labour and the Tories, and he wants to be seen in the side of the angels and all this stuff. I don't think it's got much legs. It's difficult to assess that because it hasn't happened yet, this big get together. But my guess is by next week, we probably aren't even talking about it.
Andy?
Reform UK are part of a global populist movement which is based on 3 pillars: anti-immigration, anti-wokery and anti-net zero. I wouldn't vote for them. I don't agree with what they are proposing. But I think, much like Geoff said, if you start throwing around terms like extreme right or indeed extreme left, as has been done in the past for others, you've got to watch when you do that, because you start to devalue that term. And then when somebody who actually genuinely is from the extreme right comes along, then what are they? And so I'm not comfortable. I've never been particularly comfortable with the denigration of those who you don't agree with by calling them something they're not. We had Thomas Kerr on this podcast from Reform UK.
Who defected, indeed, to Reform UK, yeah.
Do you look at that guy and say he's from the extreme right? I mean, come on, I don't think so. I think, and the reality is that if we start doing that, and if we start labelling anything outside of a pretty narrow centre as being extreme, then that's when suddenly, you get called a Nazi on Twitter because you want to cut tax, right? That's where this sort of name calling goes. I think we should reserve labels for people who deserve them, not for people who don't.
Thank you both very much indeed, Andy and Geoff, and thanks as well to our guest today, Susan Smith. Of course, you're very welcome to have your say on all that you've heard. You can email us hello@holyroodsources.com, or you can WhatsApp us 0333 404 6507. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you again next week.